Hello everybody, back with another engine rebuild video. Here today I've got the head on and leaving with my last video. Everything's all torqued down to spec, and I've got the dial gauge indicator set on the number 1 piston valve. So if you remember, I left it with the motor at top dead center, number 1 piston, and I have not touched the camshaft. Chain is not attached here. So what I'm trying to do here is set the timing. So I bring number 1 cylinder for the purposes of the valve, and the valve only up to top dead center. That's what the bore gauge is set on, and you can kind of see that it's set at 0. And then I take that and go all the way out to the number 8 valve, which would be for piston number 4, and I set the clearance on that. And the clearance on that, I believe, is a cold clearance of 0.010 inches. So I got the screwdriver and the wrench there, and I'm setting that up and setting that clearance, and I'll do a couple iterations of this just to make that set. But the important point here is that the cam chain is not attached to the camshaft. The camshaft, if you remember, I had set at number 1 at top dead center, and I have not moved that or have not touched that, and that's where that has sat. So now I'm setting the cam relative to the camshaft. So this can get a little tricky. It's a little hard to understand sometimes. The workshop manual has you set number 7 and number 8 first and come back to number 1. Essentially, I'm just doing that opposite of this. So I've got number 1 valve at its top dead center. Now I'm moving on to number 2 valve after setting the clearance of the number 8 valve. So essentially what you do is set the clearance of the valve when it's at its maximum height, which is what I'm setting up here for the dial gauge. So you set number 1 at its maximum height, and you go out and you set its companion, for lack of a better way to put it, its companion valve, and set the valve clearance on that. So if you notice, all the push rods are installed here. Everything, you can see me, I'm turning the cam here, so you can see everything's rotating. But again, the motor in and of itself, the pistons are not rotating here. So again, it's an important thing to get out as you watch this. So now I'm just kind of setting up the dial gauge here, making sure everything's fine. Not a whole lot. It's all relative here. So I'm just trying to get enough play on the enough play on the dial indicator that I can get to a 0 point here so that I can get it set up properly. So I'll get number 2 valve set up for the number 1 piston, the second valve, and then its corollary, or its brother, or whatever you want to call it, its cousin, will be the number 7 valve. So once I get this at its rocker point, essentially where it's at its maximum point, where it's completely shut, and what I'm doing here is I'm using my hands and I'm just rotating the cam back and forth. It's not incredibly difficult to operate the cam here with the camshaft disconnected from the crankshaft, obviously, because I'm only turning the cam and the valves and going against the springs, which are not that strong really. So I'll find that top dead center there, and then I'm going to go back this time to number 7 valve, which would be for the number 4 cylinder, and I've got my 0.10 inch feeler gauge in there, and I'll get that set. So then once the number 1 and the number 2 pistons are set, or excuse me, the number 1 and the number 2 valves are set, you've got the number 7 and the number 8 valves set based on that. Then it's really that's it, which is convenient about this. You don't have to go through this and do this iteration for all 8 valves and 4 pistons. Once you've got the forward and the aft end of the engine set up, you're essentially done. So there's not you only have to really do this once, I guess you could say. It's not really something that you have to go through and do all the number 1, all the number 2, all the number 3, and all the number 4. So in that way, it's once you get it figured out in your head and you understand what's going on, and you understand the procedure that's in the workshop manual, it's actually not too bad. So now once you get the cam timing set that way, you pull the chain back off and pull the sprocket back off. And what I'm doing there is just attaching the locking clip for the camshaft itself. And now I've got to put the sprocket and the timing chain on. So it's very important here not to adjust the position of the crankshaft, which is not that hard because you have the resistance of the pistons fighting against you, so it's not that hard to adjust the crankshaft. But you also want to make sure that you don't turn the camshaft at all, and that's a little bit trickier because it's relatively easy to operate. So now I've got the camshaft gear installed and the crankshaft gear is already installed, and now I've got the timing chain connecting the two. So what I'm looking at here is to make sure that the holes line up for the bolts. So interestingly, you can get about 1/4 of a tooth of adjustment depending on how you set your cam sprocket up. So if you put the cam sprocket on, you can flip it over, that gives you a 1/4 tooth. You can turn it right to left, that gives you a 1/4 tooth. You can rotate it a tooth, that gives you a 1/4 tooth. Again, I recommend you look at the workshop manual on how to do this. I'm not the video really doesn't lend itself to that instruction very well, but I figured that out, get the holes lined up, and now I'm tightening down to make sure that I've got my camshaft timing set. So once the holes are lined up, I essentially go in and tighten it down. The camshaft's locked down. No problem now. I'm not really worried now with the rotation of either the camshaft and or the motor. Again, the chain is installed, so if the camshaft rotates, the crankshaft is going to rotate and vice versa. So with the with the camshaft chain installed, there's no worries on that. So now I've got the timing set. The crankshaft and the camshaft are essentially tied to each other via the the camshaft chain. So now, if you remember, everything was temporary. Though I properly torqued it down, everything was torqued to spec. That's also an important point. Sorry to give you that, halfway through the video here. But the head got torqued down to its specifications. The timing gear and all the rocker arms and all of that were torqued to specification and sized up. So once that was all done, and I could get the camshaft timing set because of the way that I did that, and just to provide me some flexibility with adjustments and all that. If you remember, if you watched the last video, I did not put any gasket sealant or anything like that onto the head gasket. So now what I'm doing essentially is disassembling everything and now preparing for getting the head back installed and providing some lubrication here, and I'm also going to provide some head gasket sealant and everything. So what I've got here is I'm just cleaning everything out. I wasn't very particular about this at the very beginning because I wanted to get the camshaft timing set. So I'm going through using compressed air and using rags, clean rags every time, and setting all the pistons and getting everything cleaned up in the cylinder bores. Essentially, if I could get the dust or the dirt or the debris out of it, I was going to do that. So that's what I'm doing here, and just getting everything cleaned up and ready for never being able to see this part of the motor again. At least that's what I hope. So now I got the final assembly here, applying adhesive to the head gasket itself, and then I'll also go back here in a second and get the block. There's probably a more efficient way to do this. Maybe do the block first and then put the head gasket down and all that kind of stuff, but first time around, so it was what it was. But using the gaskets and stuff that I've linked to on my blog several times, getting that down, getting the head gasket down, and then got around the pistons already. Now I'm just getting the tops of the areas here. Not trying to be cheap with this stuff. Applying it relatively liberally. Bring the head over, drop the head down, and get the head torqued on. Again, there's a tightening pattern here with the head. Putting all the lock washers on, and the spacers, and then all the bolts on. So right there, I've got the tightening sequence down, and I've recently made a post on my blog for the approach that I made for tightening based on the United States Navy way for using fasteners. So if you want to take a look at that, that's on the blog. I'll put a link here in the description. But I figure the vessels that are designed to take battle damage or probably know what they're talking about when they want to torque stuff down. So that's the guidance that I followed on their approach to maximum torque. But so I followed that. Everything's torqued down here, and then I'm going to go in and put the push rods in and the connecting rods, or excuse me, the push rods in for all of the valves. And again, you can see kind of that little cardboard template there that marked number one push rod as it came out, goes back into number one push rod as it goes back in. And yeah, just real quick here, bending the lock tabs over for the camshaft bolts. Before I forgot, I got a new piece there because that's, you obviously don't want to reuse lock tabs if you can help it. So I got those bent over, and then get the valve gear or the valve linkage back in, and get that torqued down properly as well. So that was about it. So probably technically, as far as it goes, this is the most difficult thing to do as far as the the workshop manual goes. So good luck, and if you have any questions, please post. Cheers.